We are continuing the interview on March 21st, and we had gotten to the point of pretty much settling the immigration paperwork. And now you're officially immigrants to the United States. So what were some of your experiences, and positive, negative, discrimination you may have encountered? What was early life like there?
You go first.
Yeah. To me, it was just continuous adventure. What work I would do, and feeling the limitations of my education. I didn't have an American degree, and I should eventually get a PhD, which was my uncle's dream.
And yours?
Yeah, well, I felt it was useful. We were very subordinate in our research in New Brunswick.
Did you feel at any point at that time or earlier torn between following a career in science versus in art and poetry?
It kept happening, actually. It started, of course, when I escaped, and I thought that was the end of my biological career. I wasn't looking for work in England, really, but in Indonesia, well, I had been writing poetry already, of course, for a while. Indonesia, it was mostly Tinika's father who led me back to the biology by getting this royal decree passed by the government in exile in England that a doctoral degree in biology obtained in Indonesia would be equivalent, in the wartime, would be equivalent to a peacetime degree in Holland. So that's what happened, and then, of course, I was prisoner of war, and I thought that was the end of it. And when I got to New York, I lived really a little bit through an agent on artwork, but my uncle said, no, this is not good enough, and got me a desk job in New Brunswick. Meanwhile, I had been doing some illustration and some writing, and that was mostly in Dutch. I came to a point where I felt, this is 1949 or so, I should start writing poetry in English, and I did. And through somebody who should know better, I sent them to a poetry magazine in Chicago, and they took 4 or 5 of my poems, but not later. And then finally I wrote to them what the problem was, and they said, well, they don't have that freshness. So I went back. I don't like to read my own poetry, but this time I went back to my old poems, and I used the wrong words, and that gave it a certain freshness. I considered trying to write poetry in Portuguese because I don't know Portuguese. It would be very fresh.
So that the first poems you wrote in English had this freshness because of the use of words that were maybe just slightly different from what you would have used later on. Is your English not better?
They're totally off, sometimes grammatically, and
oh.
I used words that I thought existed. Innocent abroad. But I didn't feel any discrimination or anything like that. I think that it would be best to describe the financial poverty we actually had but never felt.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Well, you know, I think both Leo and I came from a background that had been made into a very poor background because of the war. Poor supplies, poor treatment, plans that that went just from one day to the other, And when we came to America, that was a much more normal society. And we also discovered, I remember reading in the paper something like scandalous situation of housing that did not have refrigerators and central heating or something. And to me that was pure luxury. So, you know, we lived in a rather primitive apartment, but it was wonderful to us.
Well,
Well, first we lived first we lived in a room, but we knew that we were not going to stay there. And then we could use an apartment that was had, you know, was furnished, but the people lived in South America for a couple of years, and they
it was a new house. The whole house was ours in a way, but it was in the middle of the woods of New Jersey in Iselin.
Yeah, we could use it. It was a complicated central heating system with 2 fireplaces, and we could use only one. And you know, and then we got this really bad winter that we weren't used to. At least I wasn't, and we were yearning for the city. So we placed an ad in the local paper in New Brunswick, and we got an apartment, and we stayed there for, I don't know, 10 years or something.
So you placed an ad that you were looking for an apartment?
Mm-hmm.
Was that how it was often done, as opposed to people advertising they had an apartment?
We had no idea, but
Yeah.
it worked.
Yeah.
And
Do you think that part of your fond memories of this period, even though it was you were living somewhat in poverty, was just they had good memories because you were together, sort of the bliss of being newlyweds?
That was the main thing, but you know, it was also together in very good circumstances.
Compared to what we had.
Yeah.
And Leo made very little money. I think he got maybe $200-300 a month or something.
We got between 3,000 and 4,000 a year, something like that.
But we could live on that, and I started a system that I have followed ever since. That when Daddy got his salary, it went to the bank. And then what we needed, we took off the bank, so we were automatically saving. And that's what we have done up to now.
That's why we're here. If we had spent the money the way I would have, we would have been...
Not here.
I hate to say
Yeah,
that.
it was never a matter of having a lot of money in our pockets, you know, or me sitting at the table, this is for that, that's for that, that's for that.
So those first few years from say 47 to 1950, when you started having a family, that was really devoted to a combination of your research and art and
I remember.
And you hadn't thought about going back to medical school, or what did you think you would do?
Well, the point was that I had a partial diploma, and I had no idea really what the value was of that in the United States, and it turned out it was nothing. But of course I did have the experience, and we were doing medical research as far as I was concerned. And I must confess that when Daddy got into more and more the instruments, I really got less interested in it, because I was interested in the people.
And as a result of that, she looked at the records of patients who we found had a long bleeding time, and found the only correlation was with aspirin. But the grant we worked on was looking for a hormone from the spleen, so our boss said, well, very interesting, but we never published that.
That was in '49, and although apparently later I got some literature from somebody that showed that it was known that aspirin had an influence on that, on platelets and bleeding time, and but it was never really pursued. But actually becoming part of treatments, that was about 15, almost 20 years later.
Where aspirin would start to be used more therapeutically and prophylactically.
And there was another thing too, that they were, I was working without being paid because I was not allowed to be paid as a visitor, and I had free meals at least. Yeah, I said we had evening meals and afternoon meals, which was a big help. And then, and they always more or less promised me that I would, get a real job once I immigrated. But when I immigrated, no, there was no money. And the nuns, this was a hospital that was in charge,
The Grey Nuns of Canada.
The Grey Nuns of Canada were in charge.
And this was St. Peter's?
St. Peter's
in New Brunswick?
Yeah. And they said, no, we do not approve of a couple both being paid.
They didn't approve of research in general, actually.
But wasn't that I think that wasn't all that uncommon after the war, that if that married women were very much discouraged from working, two-income households were very much discouraged in order to make sure that there were enough jobs available for families.
Yeah,
I think that was not uncommmen.
And it tells you also many of them had been working in factories, and when the war was over,
they
out.
Yeah,
but that was not as strong as something that at least happened in Holland, where during the Big Depression, which was worldwide, the government said that wives and husbands could not both work. And like Sapta could not work, and my mother could not have worked. But that was over.
But yeah, I think. But my understanding was after the war it was more an individual company or individual employer policy rather than a legal issue.
Oh yeah.
But it was not that strong. You know. It was well, basically, it was still the custom that the woman would take care of the children.
What were you saying?
Well, we are now in the beginning of 1950, and I wanted to add that one of my jobs was doing pregnancy tests on rabbits, using urine of pregnant women, inject them intravenously, and then look at the ovaries. And one day we felt maybe we should do a test on ourselves, or at least on a female. So we did. We went. I did the experiment. We came back on. It was a Sunday, I think, to check the rabbit, and it was positive. And on the way back on the bus, I paid for 3 people instead of 2. It was the earliest I think anybody ever paid for a passenger.
Well, I think when they discouraged me from working further, because I felt that I was entitled to some money at least, I also looked at the calendar and I said, it was at my own age. By that time I was 26, 27 years old, and I decided that if we wanted a family, we better start. And, once we had the family,
It was 29, actually. You were 29 years old.
Yeah, I was 26 when we got married, that's right. That was not, and when you were born, I was already in my 30s.
And in those days, that was considered to be quite mature to be having a family.
But she kept working until one day. We were working mostly in the animal house because the nuns felt that research had no place in the hospital. And I was in the animal house working on some spleens, I guess, and your mother came over and said, well, I have to go upstairs. Tineke came over and we have to go upstairs. She had to go upstairs now because she was beginning to deliver.
Yeah, my water broke.
So we walked back and the carpenter was sitting in his workplace right next door on the ground, and she stopped talking to him. I was very much afraid that our daughter would drop on his head, but luckily
No, it
didn't go that far.
But the one other thing I did in that hospital was I had witnessed several deliveries when I was a student, and none of them ever was with anesthesia. And I saw that it was painful, but it was bearable. You know, when you have a normal delivery, and I said, I don't want to be put under. Well, okay. And so I did not get that. I mean, when I was brought into the delivery room, the ether was already standing on the table, and and the nurse who helped with the delivery said to herself, "That's a good idea. I'm going to do that the next time," and she did.
Mm-hmm. The work situation when you had a family, were you able to support the family well, or how did you? Because at some point you decided you wanted to proceed with your career and your degree.
Not exactly. The work went on a little bit. I had good assistance and all that, but at one point I said to Dr. Moulton, I think the rabbits are not very good subjects. Would you mind if I took it myself? And he hesitated a little bit and said, "Oh, okay." So I took these capsules, I think 2 a day or so. And my platelet count did go down, and I got a nosebleed, and he told me to stop immediately.
What was it you were taking?
I have no idea. We call it thrombocytopin.
Thrombocytopin?
Yes, that was his. I didn't make that up. That was his name for it.
And I had also thrombocytopin.
Yeah, it would come from eggs. We processed a lot of
But you
eggs.
have no idea what was actually in it.
No,
It was an extract
it
from.
was 95% cholesterol.
Ah.
That may be a very good treatment.
Yeah, but he had I remember that he thought there were 2 hormones.
Yeah.
One that promoted platelet counts and one that
Suppressed.
depressed it. But I think what actually happened was that you had this unpleasant Australian woman.
Yeah, talking about how it ended up, well, the grant stopped. And then the one choice I had was to work with a woman, you remember her, her first name was Helen. I won't give her full name because it's real negative. But it was very interesting. She told me that a famous scientist in Australia had devised a system to classify fossil shells. And one day a student came over to him and said, "I think, Professor, this doesn't fit in your description." And the professor took the shell and said, "That's not," and he dropped it on the floor. Well,
This was this woman, or
this woman told me about this.
oh,
About the man she worked with. Well, then she thought she found an antibody, or at least the antigen of a certain disease, and she tested it, and she realized that she was sure it was positive, it worked. So she had to go to Mount Sinai, and they gave her a set of test tubes of blood, and she dropped them on the floor. So she learned something.
But what were
Not really,
what were
no.
some of your
But she was very impatient with me. She wanted me to boil pipettes in KOH, and they all turned whitish, and she said they were filthy. I said, no, I don't know what I called her, but I said they were...
you silly woman?
Yes, you're an unfortunate person. They're etched,
Mm-hmm.
and
Do you think
I
this?
walked off.
Do you think this was something? You know, we started to talk about some of the immigrant experiences and discrimination. Do you think this was, or
No.
this was just her personality?
Oh yes.
Yeah. Well, what were some of your other early experiences once you started to, I think once an immigrant couple starts having a family, they look at their responsibilities in the context of this new culture very differently. So what were some of your considerations there?
I would say the big problem was I was now, you could say, in research. And once you're in research, there's no way out but looking ahead for no more than 3 years at a time, because you're dependent on grants. This grant ran out, my job ended. I worked for a little while in Rutgers University in New Brunswick on chinchillas that were infected with a disease, and I looked at their blood picture. That was just a filler. But my Uncle Snapper got me a very nice letter for the people in Columbia University, and we moved to Manhattan, and I had to be, well, first I was interviewed, and that went extremely well apparently. Then there was a summer course for warm-up, and I got a B-, and that was exactly not enough to continue.
This was in 1955?
Yes, and then a week later I got a telephone call from New York University. Would I be willing to teach that course?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, did Professor Gregerson give you advice? Yes, yeah, that was him. So I called Gregerson, and I said, I don't understand this. You flunk me, and then you tell people that I should teach it. And he said, well, what grade did you get? I said, I got a B-. Well, I said, that's not so bad.
But it wasn't enough for you to be accepted
No.
to the graduate program, was that? Yeah.
Don't forget to tell that in the meantime we had moved to New York.
I did.
Yeah.
On the basis of your...
Yeah, I already
Yeah,
said that.
we've mentioned that.
Yeah.
But now I want to, there are some things that happened leading up to that, just in terms of, you know, starting to raise 2 little children in a new country, and language issues and different customs that you...
There
And
were
did you
no
feel
rent.
that you wanted to maintain some
I
old
got the impression
customs?
there were
and-
not that much typical immigrants. We knew the language, the customs didn't surprise us very much, because we've
Yeah.
seen different ones in different countries.
We never had any problem with language.
No, but you did have an...
No, we didn't.
You started by speaking Dutch with us, and then switched to English.
Yeah, that you could
Because
mention.
and
That
that
was
is a
in the
and that is a
family, yeah.
that's the point I'm trying to make.
Well, that is the point, but I think our English was totally sufficient for work and for our, social things. But once we had the children, our dream really was to raise you bilingually, and we started teaching you Dutch, because the one thing I did not know, what is the language a mother speaks in English to a little child. I only knew the Dutch one. So, and I never got much satisfaction of really, starting you off on English, because it was not, it didn't have the feeling that the Dutch childhood language had.
So even reading children's books in English didn't quite fill in what you wanted.
No, it simply was simplified English, and it was not a specific mother-to-child language which exists,
Mhm.
but I only knew in Dutch. Well, you know, it was not a big problem, but it bothered me a little bit. Well, we were able to keep you on Dutch until Jerry was about 2 or 3 years old,
That's our oldest daughter.
our oldest daughter.
Peggy is our youngest daughter.
And then one day she was in the back of the garden where we lived, and there was a fence, you know, one of these iron wired fences, and there were other little children on the other side, and they were interested in her and she was interested in them, and she started talking and they turned around and went home, and I saw it from the window, and I said, you know, that is something I do not want for my children. And that same day we switched to English.
Mhm. So here you were with two little English-speaking daughters, newly moved to Manhattan, and
No income.
and no income, and no school, and not any idea of what to do next.
No.
Yeah. Uncle Snap.
But Uncle Snapper then got me a job at Mount Sinai Hospital. And Dr. Louis Wasserman, who was not known for his gentleness, but for several other things. And my first job there was working in radio labeling hemoglobin and following its fate. And I worked with 3 women, Dina, Lina, and Nina, and they all were fighting with each other to the degree that I had to do the work while they kept fighting. I complained with Wasserman. Wasserman came down and sat on my desk and said, Vroman, I want you to know one thing. Anything you do, I can do better. So I thought, well, I have 2 children, he has no children, so we'll leave it at that. And said, yeah, I realized that. And so, all right, come up to the coagulation lab where I always wanted to be, because that fit my work with platelets and all that. And I had a good time working there with interesting people. And then I realized, I discovered a couple of things that I had a theory that, and I did some work that fit that, and the results were very nice, and I thought, wait a moment, that could be my PhD. So I wrote to Holland, and the professor in Holland, the assistant professor when I was there, was now the full-time professor in physiology. So I said, okay, you write it up and I'll show it to experts, and if it works out, come over and you get your degree. So I worked mostly at night in Mount Sinai, and
So you did your paid work during the day, and then your own research at night, or were you able to? They had to be very very
people
separate.
would get very upset if I started doing experiments.
Yeah.
I was extremely lucky because I think it was in Manila that I mentioned that there was a Red Cross thing and there was a scientific book. I read about an ellipsometer, which is an instrument that measures reflective light and the polarization and so on, and you draw conclusions. Very complicated, but it looked ideal. And after working 2 years, I think, in Mount Sinai, I realized that the man who wrote that article was on the floor below me with that instrument.
Oh.
So I went down and worked a little bit with that, and that became part of my thesis.
Now, who was the professor in Holland, and which university was it that you?
His name was Vonk, V-O-N-K. It was in Utrecht. The physiology lab at that time was in the field of grass, and I was at that time when I worked there. I was working on the elastic recovery of plasticized rubber compared to the feet of snails, and it required me sometimes to get up at 10 more minutes and to run off and in my pajamas with a coat over it.
Well,
And
you lived across the room.
yeah, and go
Yeah.
into the lab and draw a little line on a thing and then go back to bed.
So how long did it take for you to actually complete your degree through this long distance process?
From the beginning of working on my thesis,
Mm-hmm.
not more than a year, I think.
Really?
Yeah, I had a lot of stuff already that
Mm-hmm.
I didn't publish, but that was cute. I published one thing in what was called the Mansane Gewalt. Actually, that was not the official name of it.
It's just what you called it.
That was the name, no, the other.
You called it the OI for short.
Well, it was a Jewish hospital.
Yeah.
Everybody talked that way. But at that time, friends of the Snappers in South Carolina ran into a man, Ted Schnerler, who was the curator of animal behavior in the Museum of Natural History in New York. He was looking for army ants. And he told them he was looking for a physiologist because he was doing a new project. These friends knew nothing about me except that I had a big nose and I was some kind of biologist, advised him that I was the man for him. So we got this letter, I think, from Ethel Toback,
Mm-hmm.
And we
Yeah.
laughed.
asking if I was interested in this thing.
Mm-hmm.
What the heck are we going to do in the Museum of Natural History?
But
I said,
had you gotten your degree by then?
Not
or
quite.
Not? Oh, yeah.
This is interesting because there was a problem. Well, I went there and there was Ethel Toback, young but with white hair, and her husband Charlie was sitting in the chair reading a newspaper. So I said, you're Vroman, I want to introduce you to my husband. So Charlie lowered his paper. So I went back to his paper. And later I found out that he was sitting there to find out if I was a fake or not.
Mm-hmm.
He had a very sharp nose for fakes. And I passed that test apparently. So then I went back to work in Mount Sinai and I got this call from that Schnerler. At Mount Sinai I was getting $4,000 a year. So he said, well, we'd like to have you, what kind of salary did you think of? Well, I thought I should get more than $4,000. I said, how much? 6,000. I said, 6,000, all right, we'll make it 7,000. Is that all right with you? I said, it was fine with me. Okay, in that case, we'll make it 9,000.
Obviously, you were a very shrewd bargainer.
But tell the story of when you told it to
To Wasserman.
Wasserman.
Wasserman, meanwhile, realized that I had a brain or something like that. And he said, well, Vroman, I don't want you to go. Well, we can offer you some more money if you to see how much are they offering you? I said 9,000. No, can't match that. That was the end of that one.
Now, in the meantime, though, there were also, and you were obviously busy with being a mother to little kids. But what were some of the? You'd mentioned that there were some scams and things that you sort of fell victim to, maybe because of your immigrant status in part, but also your general.
Mostly that we fell for all these scams.
Oh no, that was when we were just married, because people would come to the door and in the hospital, and well, the first one was really something.
The boy selling
Well, the boy
subscriptions.
selling subscriptions. So we said, okay, we'll take the New Yorker. Huh?
Mm-hmm.
So we paid him. Never got the New Yorker. So finally we called the New Yorker and said, we never got that money, so
Mm.
we knew never do that again. Then one day somebody came in, I think it was also in the hospital,
Yeah,
and he was talking
he
about...
came to me first.
Hmm?
First he came to me.
Oh yeah.
He said, Mr. Vroman, I realized you're very famous. I said, true. But I liked it. And he said, so if you can sign this, we can show you your autograph, and you'll get a free encyclopedia. So I said, oh, not bad. So I signed, and didn't read the small print where it said that every year you had to pay $300 for an additional volume.
Mm.
So then he went next door where Tineke happened to be working, and
So I was not about to get an encyclopedia on our salary. So I said, no. I said, well, I just sold one. I said, you did? Yes, to that bullpen. See, there he goes. And that was, he totally lost that sale, of course.
Mm.
well, we had to cancel it.
Yeah.
Then
And then
the funeral man.
and I don't really know how that started.
Got a telephone call. Congratulations, you won a
Yeah.
funeral plot.
And you know, I was
A
thinking,
burial plot?
Burial.
Yeah.
I was thinking of the future. I remember we just married, and I think we didn't even have children yet. And I said, well, eventually we'll have to die, and then at least we have the funeral plot.
Well, he showed us a book where we could be buried. Could be buried under a globe or under an angel. And it was all free, but we had to pay for a copper plate with a hole in it, with an inverted vase in it, and if you got flowers, apparently you crawl out of your grave, turn the vase around and put the flowers in it. That was $250. So we looked, and then, in the end of the book was a picture of if he didn't do that. It was raining on his photograph. There was a nasty man with an umbrella, and a girl without an umbrella, and the man was pointing into a hole and said, that's where your daddy is going to be.
Did it really
Well,
say?
Well, what happened was, we said at one point, we said, well, you know, we really want to be cremated. And the man said, yes, but what do you do with all the bones and the ashes? They have to be buried, you know. And then, so we said, well, okay, so we wrote a check. And then next to our house was an undertaker. And Daddy decided to ask, was the man right? He said, no, you can do what you want with your bones. So we stopped the check.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, were they on the phone for weeks.
They're ready to start action.
I said they were going to kill you.
But anyway, it was good enough for us. And then we had one other thing that was much worse. We had several friends of ours who needed a loan, and they needed a co-signer. And they asked us to co-sign, and they defaulted, and we had to pay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing we never did.
And do you think in those situations that there were people who it was more just maybe taking advantage of your good nature rather than the fact that you were immigrants and maybe didn't understand the system, or
It had nothing
It's
to do
just-
with immigrants.
No, I
it
don't
was
think
just
so.
that they may have not intended to default, but they just thought that you were nice people that they could ask a favor of.
No.
No? You weren't nice people.
They never even apologized.
Yeah.
And I said to myself, you know, we did not want them to get into trouble, and it was not very much, it was a few $100.
Mhm.
But we decided that from then on we would give the money,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what we did.
Yeah. So during the time that you were working, and as you said, it was only a year really that you had to do this difficult schedule of
Yeah.
working in the day and then doing your research at night. did you have, I don't imagine you would have had much time for doing any writing or artwork or...
No, I kept writing poetry. And 1947, well, I should go back a little bit, if you don't mind, to the prisoner of war time, because in Chilacap I was sharing a cubbyhole, you could call it, with the fellow prisoner Erik de Vries. He was at that time known in Holland as the one who started television. He was was more than 6 feet tall and had a beard and looked impressive and had a fantastic memory. He read my poems and he memorized them.
In camp?
In camp. He wrote poems himself to the tunes of the Three-Penny Opera and stuff like that, and they were performed. But after the war, apparently, there was a meeting where a famous Dutch author, Vesdijk, attended also, and he apparently started saying, "The greatest poet of Holland is dead."
Who was it who said that?
Erik de Vries. And then he started reciting my poems, thinking I was dead. And you can do the rest.
Well, I think you should put something else. You had more or less a bundle of poetry, and you met in New York a Dutch author, and he saw them and he said, "Give them to me and I'll show them to my publisher." And the publisher was Querido, and that's how that he started.
And these were poems that had been written in camp?
In camp.
And
So the first collection of poetry came out in 1947, called Gedichten, poems. And then the next one was poems I'd written before the war and after. So it was, the title in English would have been Poems Before and After.
But with Erik de Vries, he was, they split into different camps, and he returned to Holland, and he, eulogized Daddy unnecessarily, and somehow I got, oh yes, he had my address, and he wrote me a letter, also very carefully worded, that he had known you. So by that time I already knew that...
Could you stop it a moment?